Thinking back all these years, what makes Linklater so good about making those around him better? Because you obviously had 0 acting credits going into this film, but you have a presence in this movie that is still very memorable all these years later.
Well, Rick kind of typified this sort of like indie 90s film directing style where he could really like bring out interesting performances and new actors, unprofessional actors. And it was really great. It was great to have that be my first experience. I didn't quite have the same experience with some other directors. Luckily, I've worked with like a lot of people who were also from Austin who were like inspired by Rick or worked for Rick at one time or another, and that same kind of like ease of working with actors and that collaborative style of directing has kind of like reverberated out through them. But what was the original question?
What made him so good at making those around him better? And I think you answered it well.
Yeah, I think it was that sort of collaborative style of work. He gets a very naturalistic feel in his performances that some people are like, oh, is that improv? And it's typically not improv, certainly not in a movie like this that was shot on film, but there's a really nice process of like developing a scene that's really collaborative where the actors come up with stuff. And I think it shined with, especially using younger actors.
Yeah, no question. Lots of younger actors. I don't know how much you were a part of the party scene that was going on that has been talked about pretty heavily over the last several years now. So you were shooting your scenes and you were going home at night since you were still so young.
Yeah, it was the LA actors who were all at the hotel together unsupervised that were having wild parties and stuff. I was 15. I went home to mommy every night, so that's no fun for me.
That's not to say that 15-year-olds in Austin weren't having their own fun at that time, but you were obviously a big part of this. I don't know if you were a part of the 25th anniversary screening at Zilker 5 years ago, but when was the last time you watched this movie?
So it's been a long time since I've actually watched it. I had a really hard time watching it for like in my 20s, early 30s. Like I had just seen it so many times and that like every little mannerism and like twitchy thing that I do was just like driving me crazy, which I think I've heard from some people. Some of it drives them crazy too.
Are you telling me that you played the Mitch touching his nose drinking game?
I played the drinking game, and don't do that, ladies and gentlemen. You will die. But, you know, I was a really kind of a twitchy kid who was precocious, and that being precocious was maybe a kind of a way to mask that. And I actually think now in retrospect, I like those rough edges where that sort of like twitchy, awkward inner self kind of comes out. I think it violates some sort of like cinematic contract to some people who watch it, but to me it feels like kind of real.
I completely agree with that. I watched this movie earlier today for the first time in forever, and I know everybody's had fun with that over the years, but I mean, you are an 8th grader who's about to go into high school who is very unsure of himself and also surrounded by a bunch of older people who have just beat the hell out of you too. So yeah, you should be nervous about things.
Yeah, the character, like I'm acting, but the character is also acting in this movie, right? He's trying to figure out how to perform a self that's going to be acceptable to these different like older people.
Considering that you became so well known for this role, and I realize it wasn't immediate, which adds another weird layer to it, was there some coping that you had to come to in terms of acceptance and a willingness to talk about the role over time, or is that something that you were always pretty comfortable with?
I think I had a hard time in the middle period where I was really trying to do other stuff in life and was just always being identified as being connected to this. I think it was hard to get people to maybe take me seriously at first for things like going into academia or like doing different like programming work, stuff that you don't want to be perceived as like stoner party kid for. But now in retrospect, I feel like I really embrace it. I think it's like an important part of my life and my identity. And it opened up so many doors for me. Like I got to do some other movies. I got to meet incredible people. It's been great.
Who is somebody that just had your jaw on the floor that you got to meet as a result of Dazed and Confused?
I mean, I feel like there was a lot of people in this movie that have really gone on to incredible things, and just gotten to actually know them as opposed to just like, I don't know, meeting a famous person in an elevator or something has been really great. So the whole cast, it's probably not a satisfying answer, but...
And you are a programmer now. Do you make games? I read that someplace, but anywhere from 5 to 95% of what you read on the internet is BS. So what do you do these days?
Yeah, so I had a failed game project in like 2011 where I was working with other programmers, and I was kind of like producing it and art directing it, and that was kind of a traumatic experience. Like there's a demo that works, but we ran out of funds, we ran out of like interests, we didn't have a PC version of it, so it was kind of a disaster that I learned a lot from, and like what not to do. So I ended up going to school. I kind of speed ran undergrad and an MFA at the Game Lab at UCLA, and I just kind of learned how to do every role, and I'm fresh out of that. I got out last summer, and my first project, I did a thesis project, which was this bizarre art game where I used DNA data to turn my family tree into a dungeon that you can navigate, and it's like a real-time sort of time-based web thing where there's these cenotaphs, and you perform acts of care, and there's like 3D scanned relics from the family farm. My family were Czech immigrants to Texas in the 1800s. So I did that. No one will ever play it, but it was a great experience. And now I'm working on another sort of installation art game with one of my professors, Daniel Snelson, who's at the Game Lab. That's this sort of haunted 8-bit Mormon soccer game with a parallel history that's sort of behind the facade of the game itself. That's my elevator pitch. It's very weird and very beautiful, and it involves 6 hours of VHS footage of the longest Guinness Book of World Records longest outdoor soccer game, where a high school team and their coach lost their minds and began hallucinating. 6 hours of this footage is buried in this game. It's called Soccerthon 88.
Is everyone in the crowd a sister wife?
I'm not gonna get into the critique. There's a critique inherent in this game of a lot of things, including some aspects of Mormon culture. But yeah, it's an extremely Mormon crowd. There are some white faces in there, but
I guess I won't ask the soaking follow-up then. All right, so let me.
We will not talk about soaking. So the genealogy game, the weird Mormon lead-in is that I have a grandfather that I never met that abandoned my father's family, converted to Mormonism to marry a young widow. And when you do that, the Mormons are obsessed with genealogy, and they do all of this genealogical research for various religious reasons. And when I started doing this genealogical research, I connected with all of the research he had done. So I basically made this game with a grandfather I never met. And that's the twain from that project to this one.
It's incredible. I want to have a longer conversation with you about this, but we don't have all the time in the world.
My thesis, it's only 600 pages long.
What do you think the lasting impact is of Dazed and Confused? This is obviously a movie that cannot be made in 2024 just because there's too much cell phone usage, but what do you think the lasting impact is of this film?
I think it was really interesting as being an origin point in the 90s. I mean, there's historical, American neorealist films that are very naturalistic, that they're using, Portapac and handheld recording. So, the resurgence of that, I think, having these sort of, raw performances that seem real or unpolished or maybe even are annoying, I think was a really nice moment in time. And it had weird effects on media. I feel like a lot of reality television was actually this kind of strange, dark after effect of this wave of 90s indie movies, because some of the people that were involved in those movies went on into TV because they couldn't get movies made and ended up doing weird reality projects. My friend Dia Sokol worked with Andrew Bujalski, ended up doing all this reality TV. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was this little tiny cultural moment in time that resonated out into the rest of the culture.
Guttural response is probably a bad thing, because I don't think...
It's probably a bad thing, although I love Dia, I love the stuff that she's done, but yeah, reality TV has gone dark.
Wiley, blown away by this conversation. Thank you so much for the time, and congratulations on everything.
Yeah, it's great meeting you. Great talking to your folks.